Hey folks, it's Dr. Gilchrist, and since we will not be having class tomorrow, I thought it would be a good idea to go ahead and record this video to help you get a better idea of sensation and perceptions. We're going to finish up visual perception, and then we're going to go ahead and start talking about auditory perception, as well as our senses of touch, taste, and smell. Now, I think I'm going to skip touch a little bit. We are going to talk a little bit about pain perception and why pain perception is important. But make sure you check that out in your book. Also, a friendly reminder that your Chapter 5 quiz will post tomorrow at 12 a.m. and it will be due at 5 o'clock on Monday. All right, so let me go ahead and share screen. There we go. We're going to share. Wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up our slides. There it is. Okay. So where we last left off, we were talking a bit about our principles of visual perception and some of the different things that we do to help us recognize objects that are around us. So we started by talking about the Gestaltists and how we basically separate objects from their background. We talked about some of our different perceptual grouping principles. We talked about depth perception so that we can actually start to use information to help us judge the dimensions of an object as well as the distance of the object. And where we left off last time, we talked quite a bit about what are called binocular cues. So just as a very friendly reminder, binocular cues are depth cues that require a single eye to use. So we talked about those on Monday, or on Wednesday rather, and that will include retinal disparity, the fact that each of your eyes captures a slightly different view of the world, and then also convergence. This is basically the idea that eyes are going to move inward for nearer objects, and they're going to move outward for objects that are farther away. So as we talked about with retinal disparity, something else that you can do to kind of see the view that each of your eyes is capturing is by creating a finger sausage. I will obviously not be doing this because I am trying to record this for you. But the idea here is that you're going to have your index fingers, you're going to point them about ½ inch apart and about 5 inches or so in front of your eyes. And at some point, if you let your eyes relax, you will begin to see a finger sausage, like a little ball between them. And that's happening because each of your eyes is catching a slightly different view of the world. And because of that, you're getting this little extra ball. And you can move your fingers closer or farther together to see how that viewpoint changes. Now, something else that we actually kind of use binocular disparity or retinal disparity for is for the creation of 3D movies and 3D images. So I already kind of mentioned on Wednesday that this is all kind of based on binocular disparity. So when you go to a 3D movie, they actually exaggerate the binocular disparity with the film, and then you're given glasses that will help kind of magnify that disparity and create a 3-dimensional image. What you're looking at here is what is called a stereogram, and it's kind of the same idea. If you can relax your eyes, you may very slowly begin to see the 3-dimensional image of a rose appear. Now, I often tend to find that when I do this, I have a tendency to want to kind of converge my eyes rather than have my eyes diverge. So I want to cross my eyes instead of having my eyes kind of move outward. And because of that, whenever I try to see these, the image is always inverted. If you're trying to relax your eyes and you're moving them out, this will actually create a 3-dimensional image of a rose that pops out. So now we're going to talk a little bit about our monocular cues. These are cues for depth perception that are available to one single eye. So we only need one eye to be able to judge the depth and distance using these different types of cues. So the very first one that I'm going to talk about is what is called relative size. So basically, if we have two different objects that we assume are similar in size, such as these pencils, we are going to perceive the one that casts the smaller retinal image to actually be farther away from us. So in the case of these two pencils, if we're assuming that the pencils are the same size, the one that is smaller will be considered farther away. Another monocular cue that we have is what is called interposition. Objects that are closer to us will block objects that are farther away. So for example, if you can kind of see in the little corner of the screen, me in my office, you can see that my plush Gritty is partially blocked by my shoulder. And that's because Gritty is farther away from me. And so I'm blocking my plush toy. One of the ways that you can actually kind of see playing with interposition is this painting by Rene Magritte. And the longer that you look at it, the less sense it actually appears to make, because you do believe that the horse and the rider are in front of everything, but there are instances where some trees are blocking parts of the horse, or the rider appears directly on the tree. And so it kind of plays with your perception, and it plays with this notion of interposition that becomes more and more entertaining the longer that you look at it. So here's kind of another example. So if you had to judge what shape in this image is closest to you, you're going to go ahead and say, well, the star is, and you're going to assume that the moon is farther away here. Now, how do you know that? Well, we have three shapes in this image. Now, some people like to be really smart and say, well, the black rectangle is the one that's farthest back. We're not actually counting that as a shape here. So we have our blue star. That is blocking a pink rectangle, which is also, and that pink rectangle is blocking our moon. So we can look at which objects are blocking which. No object is blocking the star, and so we can assume that that one is the closest. The pink rectangle that the star blocks the moon. So we're going to assume that the moon is the furthest away. Another monocular cue that we can use is what is called relative height. So you'll probably experience this phenomenon if you are driving, and you'll see objects that seem to be very, very high up on the horizon. That is a case of relative height, where objects that are higher in our view are often judged to be farther away. So we're going to assume, for example, looking at this image, that this object right here is farther away than this one. Another cue that works for motion rather than for static objects is what is called relative motion. Another term that we sometimes use for relative motion is something called motion parallax. And this is basically that if you are moving somewhere, so if you're driving, you're a passenger in a vehicle, or you're on a bus, or you're on a train, this obviously won't work well with something like an airplane, because you're just moving way too fast, and at some point you're up above the clouds. But what we find is that when we are moving out in the world, objects that are closer to us move faster, and they tend to move in the opposite direction of us. So if you're a passenger in a car, you may kind of look out of your window and look at the lines on the road that are kind of parallel to you. And what you'll find is that those lines will move very, very quickly. And as you are moving forward, the lines will be perceived to be moving backward. Now, on the other hand, objects that are farther away, they tend to move more slowly and they move in the same direction that we do. So you may experience this if you are driving somewhere at night. You may get the sensation that the moon, which is incredibly far away from you, will be moving and following you in the same direction because it's far away and it will appear to move more slowly and with you. Another monocular cue that we use to help us is what is referred to as linear perspective. So as you can kind of see here, this is the freight elevator for the man who has everything. This comes from the New Yorker. But the idea is that we can conceive of the world around us as being made up of parallel lines. And so parallel lines will appear to converge in the distance. So parallel means that these lines never touch. But the more that they appear to converge, the farther away in the distance that you're looking. And artists and painters have often used linear perspective to help create a three-dimensional sense of depth and distance in what is essentially a two-dimensional canvas. We also use light and shadow to create a sense of depth. Objects that are dimmer to us tend to be perceived to be farther away. When you use things like makeup, like contours and highlighters, you are actually also creating a sense of depth and distance. Using highlighter, such as on your cheekbones, will actually kind of draw the eye toward it, and it will bring that cheekbone out and make it seem like it's popping out a bit more than it otherwise would. On the other hand, using a contour, for example, nobody really does this anymore. Like, this is from about 5 years ago when contouring was much, much more popular than it is now. Using a contour underneath your cheekbone causes that portion to kind of have the appearance of recessing or moving farther away. And thus, your cheekbones will appear to pop out through the use of highlighting, so lighting, and then shadowing or contouring. Now, one of the things that we tend to find that makes visual perception very, very difficult is that our world is always changing. So you can kind of see this if you open or close a door. So if I open a door and then I start to have that door close, what you're going to notice is that that door is going to change its shape. Now, what's kind of amazing about this is that despite the fact that this is changing its shape, we never go, oh my gosh, this is a brand new thing. I don't know what happened to the door. It was a rectangle, and now I've got this new thing that doesn't look like a rectangle at all. So despite the fact that objects are constantly changing their shape in our view, or there's changes in color due to lighting conditions, or based on depth and distance, objects will change their size, we perceive objects as unchanging, even when the conditions around us, such as the lighting conditions or our retinal images, change. And this is what is known as perceptual constancy. The world is always changing, but we are going to assume that objects and object properties generally are not changing. So let's talk about each of these in greater detail. So first we have size constancy. So this kind of goes back to our depth cue of relative size. Now, if something that I assume it, like my hand, so I'm going to move my hand very close to the camera and I'm going to move it farther away. Now, as you're kind of watching me in the corner of the screen, you're going to notice that my hand gets larger on your retinal image. But you know that objects don't really change like that. They do not suddenly shrink or grow like that. And hands, we generally know what size hands are. So if a hand is getting larger in your retinal image, we're going to assume that that's happening because it is closer to you. So we're going to assume that size is always constant. And if we see a difference in size, that means that there are issues with distance. So if I have these 2 points right here, which in fact we're going to assume are the same size, we're going to assume that this one is casting the smaller retinal image because it is farther away. Now, we can actually use things like size constancy to create really fun illusions that I will show you in a little bit. Now, we also have color constancy. Now, you might be asking yourself, my sense of color is based on the light that is reflected on an object. So if there's less light to go around, that would mean that the color of the object would change. So you might be thinking that. And in this case, I mean, you're not wrong. Our sense of color absolutely comes from the light that is reflected off of objects. But again, we know that things don't just suddenly change color on us. So if colors look a little different, it is not because the object itself is changed. It is because the lighting is changed. And here's what's kind of interesting. My sensation of these apples as being green is going to be the same no matter what the lighting conditions are. And this is because we keep track of what cones are activated and the degree to which they are activated. And what we're going to find is that each of our 3 cones responds in a certain ratio based on the color of the object. When our lighting conditions are different, what we're going to find is that we're going to discard information about the ambient lighting so that we can get a better sense of color. And again, there are some really interesting illusions that you can actually create with things like color constancy. So for example, if you take a look at the blue dots on this cube, you'll notice that each of them looks slightly different because the lighting conditions on each side of the cube are different. This one is brightest, this one is a little bit dimmer, and this one is very, very dark. And yet, despite the difference in lighting conditions, and despite the fact that each of these shades of blue look slightly different from each other, they're all the same color. They're all the same color. So we can kind of play with this color constancy and our sense of color constancy with these illusions. Here's another example, and this one's pretty famous. I first learned about this in college, and I am still amazed by it to this day. So here we have square A and square B. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, B is certainly a lighter color than A. B is a lighter shade of gray than A. But what if I actually told you they are completely the same color? And it turns out that they are. If you're curious, you can actually take an eyedropper tool and pick up the color and see how much red, green, blue are present in each. And what you'll find is that they're exactly the same. Now let's talk a little bit about how this works. So what we find is that this cylinder casts a shadow. So when we see this darker color with B, we're going to assume that the reason that it's darker is because it's covered by the shadow of the cylinder. A doesn't have that, so we can't really discount the color. But in this case, because the cylinder casts a shadow, we assume that the darker color of B happens specifically because that shadow is cast. We discard the shadow, and this creates the perception that B has a lighter shade of gray when in fact they are exactly the same. Here's another fun illusion that makes use of color vision. So as you're kind of looking at this is one of my favorite ones. You may get the sense that you are looking at blue and green spirals. But if you look very, very closely at the spirals, especially if you want to blow this image up and take a look at it, the colors are actually the same. You're getting the sensation that they're blue and green because if you take a look at the spirals, here's what you notice. The ones that look bluer those are intercut with a pinky purple, and some of that pink purple color bleeds into that shade, giving it a cooler, more blue looking appearance. On the other hand, the ones that look green are intercut with orange. Some of that orange will bleed into that color, giving it a more yellowish, greenish appearance, despite the fact that these colors are exactly the same. We can also play around with shape and size constancy. So for example, you can kind of see this big monster chasing this little monster. If you want, put your hands up to the screen and you will actually find that the monsters are exactly the same size. But we've used things like linear perspective to play with your sense of size constancy. And you can actually see this in B as well. Now, one of the things that we will find is that context really matters in terms of judging size and distance. So what you're looking at here is very famous. It is referred to as the Muller-Lyer illusion. So what you're looking at here are two lines, and each of these lines is kind of flanked by arrows. And so you will have the perception as you're judging the length of these lines that the ones that have the arrows that are kind of flanking like this, that line is going to be longer than the ones that have arrows that are going inward like this. And what we're going to find is that no, the lines are actually the same length. They are not different, but those flankers create the perception of a longer appearance. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting is that you would think that because this is a perceptual process, that most of us are going to equally fall for the Muller-Lyer illusion. And that's not actually true. So this is a case where we have some cultural differences. What we find is that people are a lot more likely to fall for the Muller-Lyer illusion if they live in spaces like these that make use of corners and angles and linear structures. What we tend to find is that other cultures that do not have housing situations that kind of look like these, maybe they live in something that's circular like a yurt, what we're going to find is that they are less likely to fall for this illusion. So this was always something that's really surprising to me, because I thought in general we process things like this the exact same way. And because this is an early kind of process in terms of cognition, that everybody approaches it the same way. But that's actually not true. Our perception can absolutely be modified by our culture. I'm going to go ahead and skip this. I will show you this at the beginning of class on Monday. This is a very famous perceptual illusion referred to as an Ames room. So I'll talk a little bit more about this next time. The Ames room is a situation where we create a sense that one person has shrunk in size and one person has become a giant through using things like viewing items through a pinhole, slightly angling the floor, and actually having the back wall at a diagonal rather than being perfectly at a 90-degree angle. So this creates the sense that they are actually in a room that is square. If you notice, the room is not really square at all. So one thing that I will mention here, and I've already kind of brought this up, culture influences our perception and context influences our perception. So depending on the culture that you are in, you may perceive this as being a window. But on the other hand, if you are part of a culture that still has people balancing items on their head as a means of carrying things, you may actually perceive that the woman in this image is actually balancing a box on her head. Likewise, if you live in a lot of indoor spaces, you may think that this is kind of part of a house, maybe it's a chimney, but if you're part of a culture that spends more time outdoors rather than indoors, you may be more likely to perceive this as something like a tree. So here are just some fun visual illusions for you. I hope you enjoy them. So the longer that you look at this, the more complicated it gets. That elephant has way too many legs and they're not always attached to his body. You may think that these two lines are exactly straight when they are blocked by this black rectangle, but as it turns out, they are not. And this one is fun. This was one that was originally developed by Oreo for Twitter. If you focus on one circle, you may find that the other circles that you are not looking at appear to move. This is sometimes referred to as the Ouroboros illusion. So I'm going to maybe do 5 more minutes of our other senses. I'm recording this on Zoom, so I can't necessarily get a good bead for how long I've been doing this. So I am going to start to talk about hearing, but we will finish this up on Monday and move into learning and conditioning. So one of the things we are going to find is that vision is generally our best known sense. It's the one that we use the most, and it's the one that has a tendency to dominate and overtake our other senses. And this is what is known as visual capture. So for example, right now you are listening to me present this information to you on a video. So you're probably watching a visual, maybe on your camera, maybe on your phone. Now, I want you to think about where you think the sound that you are hearing as you watch a video of me is coming from. Odds are pretty good you're perceiving the sound as actually coming from my mouth. When you watch a video of me, the sound is not actually coming from my mouth. The sound is coming from the speakers. But because you see me speaking, you're going to use that visual information to change how you interpret where the location of the sound is coming from. This is what is called the ventriloquist illusion, and it really highlights how vision tends to overtake our senses. So hearing. When we talked about sensation, we talked about the fact that we are taking physical stimulus energy from the environment, and we're going to turn that into a signal that the brain can actually use. Now, when we talked about vision, we were talking about the physical stimulus energy of light. When we are talking about hearing, we're talking about sound waves that actually create physical changes in air pressure. So what you're looking at here are examples of what sound waves look like. Sound waves function like sine waves in the environment. You see they kind of had these alternating periods of compression and expansion. And what we're going to find is that when we look at a sound wave, there are a couple of different things about that sound wave that will affect how we perceive the sound. So first we have amplitude. Amplitude is basically how high the wave goes. So a quieter sound like this one will have a lower amplitude. A louder sound will have a higher amplitude. So the amplitude of the sound wave contributes to our perception of the loudness of the sound. We also need to talk about frequency. So frequency is how many up and down alternations that we get during a particular period of time. Now, in sound, we measure frequency in hertz. Hertz is basically how many alternations we get in a second. So hertz is measured as cycles per second. A low frequency sound will have very few alternations per second. A higher frequency sound will have many alternations per second. The frequency of a sound corresponds to our perception of the pitch of a sound. So lower pitched sounds, so low sounds like this, will tend to have a lower frequency. On the other hand, higher pitched sounds like this will have a higher frequency. And so that can kind of help you figure out some of these different perceptual aspects of sound and what aspects of the sound wave actually contribute to those perceptions. I'm going to go ahead and stop here because talking about how sound moves through the ear is probably something that is better done one-on-one in a class situation. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here. Have a wonderful weekend as you watch this video. And we'll talk more about hearing and touch and taste and smell next time. Whoop.